We're about to start the session on emerging economies managing the permanence of spillovers. Probably 2 years ago, most of us were thinking that the Fed was going to continue tightening policy, and maybe even Europe start to tighten its monetary policy. That has not happened. Probably we'll have expansionary monetary policies in the developed markets for some years to come still. And we have the added problem of trade tensions that have affected our markets in the last year. When I saw the numbers, what we have seen is that 500 biggest portfolio managers have more than 1.25% of our GDP. Not even in the best years, the gross inflow to emerging markets has been more than 1% of that, or the outflows by that case. And what we have seen is that since the crisis, according to Alejandro, even in our case, we saw it a little bit before the crisis. Just when the subprime problems started to appear, we saw a big inflow. They, of course, continue until Lehman. Then during Lehman, 6 months, you have outflows. Then the inflows started again very strongly until the announcement of the tapering from Bernanke in May 2014. And there were a succession of events, the fall in the price of oil in 2014, the depreciation of the Chinese renminbi, August 2015. So this period of inflows started again, mostly after March of 2016. During these 3 years almost, we have seen movements one way or the other. I am going to talk about my country, for example. Last week we appreciated 2%, 2 weeks ago we appreciated 2%. And according to a Trump tweet or some news, you can see more and more inflows of outflows. Actually, with Alejandro and Beratay, we were discussing on Sunday at Basel how the importance of algorithms have become for the FX market in emerging markets. And now they are more important. You see more than the spot market. What we're seeing is bets on the derivatives market, and that has become much more important. And one additional point maybe that I would like to make before giving the floor to the speakers. I believe in many cases, the emerging markets with strong fundamentals have become started to become a conventional asset class. When we started seeing this big inflow of capital, when I say big inflows of capital, they might add to 8%, 9% of GDP in 1 year. For small economies, they are pretty big. We didn't have even investment grade. Now we are weak A and strong B, according to the credit rating agencies. But even before being investment grade, you had a lot of inflows coming in. And what we're seeing, for example, in our bonds, the bonds in domestic currency, they are around 4% with an interest rate of 2.5 overnight and 2% inflation. That is, our rate now is the one that every developed country had before the crisis, even lower. Remember the 10-year bond in 2007 was 5.25, the American Treasury bond. And what we're paying now for a bond in dollars is less than 2.5% per year. Our spread is less than 100 basis points. Probably euro will be paying less than 1%. We don't issue euros, which is surprising. What we see is that these inflows probably are going to continue, and probably a lower neutral rate of interest on developed countries are also going to drive lower neutral interest rate in many of our countries. So how to manage this situation where probably I don't know, it says permanent inflows or permanent spillovers. Probably we'll see a lot of events where these things are reversed, but that is going to be Europe to be explained. First, we will have Liliana Rojas Suarez. Liliana comes from the Center for Global Development. She mentioned when she asked a question in the last panel, she has been working at IMF, Deutsche Bank, IDB, Colombia, and probably I'm sure of our places where you have worked, Lynn. Diana is going to give a big picture of how she sees emerging markets, the reaction, and the implication for the future. Please, Liliana.
Can I have that little toy? Good afternoon. Before I get the pointer, I face two challenges this afternoon. The first is that I'm the first speaker after lunch, which is always a big challenge. But the second one is that I'm the only one that is not a governor in the panel. And that is an even bigger challenge because I'm supposed to talk about risk for emerging markets, and they are the governors. So let's see how it goes. So permanence of spillovers is in the title, and I have to address that. So the first thing is when we talk about sources of spillovers, what are emerging markets concerned? From my perspective, a central issue is actually the loss of liquidity at any point in time, because what has been happening is that there has been a huge expansion, as Julio just mentioned, a huge expansion of liquidity over the years. Part of the resolution of the global financial crisis implied that created liquidity that was going everywhere. And emerging markets was not an exception at all. Now, the question is whether that liquidity in emerging markets is temporary or permanent. Because it's actually, there was a long period of time where the markets would go absolutely anywhere. That's the time when Argentina was able to place a 100 years bond, remember? Or loans to Ukraine in the middle of big crisis, Crimea. I mean, it doesn't matter where the risks were, capital markets were willing to fund, right? So, and that is, in my view, a creation of temporary liquidity. Why? Because it's really not following the fundamentals of each country, but it can be actually reversed at a point in time. Now, two features of these sources of spillovers that I will describe in a second are that they have been presenting themselves with two features. One, in waves. What do I mean by waves? By waves, I mean that we have had announcements that implied sudden reversal of inflows, but immediately, and especially given the large differential in interest rates and therefore yield, immediately, if the shock kind of looked like, okay, it's not going to be permanent anymore, then again, there was another increase in inflows towards emerging markets. But the other one is that many of the shocks have displayed persistence. An example of a non-persistent shock, but give you an idea of the first wave, is the temper tantrum, 2013. Not persistent, but a wave in the sense that, you know, there was a huge outflow and then an inflow when the realization was that it was not persistent. But the decrease in commodity prices since 2014 has been persistent for a number of countries. So in the last waves of shocks facing from the north, and I'm using the word north to imply advanced economies, spillovers from the US seems to dominate. The US dominance through uncertainties about where the Fed rates is going to go. Yes, it's more dovish stance right now, but now there's not complete, insurance that there's going to be another decline in the near future. Dollar appreciation, something extremely important because of the channel through trade and finance, that implies that the dollar has become expensive, and many countries actually need, both for imports, the dollar-denominated goods and services, but most importantly also because it exposes currency mismatches in a number of other countries. And finally, of course, I don't call it the US-China war, trade war. I call it the US-led trade war, because it has been moving along the lines of what the US basically has been imposing. And it goes beyond China, right? Remember the threats to Mexico too. Now, of course, I cannot leave aside the important and persistent role of the slowdown in China for the rest of emerging markets, not only the Asian countries, but also Latin America, because being China is a large demander of goods producing in Latin America, commodities, but basically. So what all this has resulted in has been, as I just mentioned, in a big fluctuation of capital inflows, basically surges and reversals of flows. This is a graph from the IIF that I like to follow, that basically won't have time to explain the methodology, but what it shows is that the pink bars show the reversals of inflows. And the spikes, the green spikes, are the surge of capital inflows, okay? And what you notice from the graph is two things. I don't have the whole story from the past, but they have started to become more, the reversals have becoming more frequent. But most interestingly, and the last one is the August reversal, is that the duration of every reversal is longer. So the attitudes of the investors is basically a little bit, although not sufficient yet, I would say, cautious about what to do about emerging markets. Now, the first question, if you worry about spillovers, is how vulnerable are countries, are emerging markets to these spillovers? Well, from my perspective, the countries that would be most affected in this last wave of spillovers, as I have described them, because again, it goes by wave, and so in the last waves, are those that have larger external financing needs because of uncertainty in the investors' base about whether the flows are actually going to continue in the same amounts to emerging markets. The second is the largest share of debt denominated in US dollars especially because of the appreciation and sustained appreciation of the US dollar. That's another permanent shock, not permanent, but persistent. Nothing is permanent in this world, but persistent, there are. And the US dollar appreciation is there as a persistent shock, and therefore those type of situations are also a source of problems for some emerging markets. And the last characteristics are those countries with weak growth dynamics in themselves. Those that having being exposed to a motor of growth coming from abroad doesn't have that anymore and now have to rely on their own productivity growth, on their own capacity to grow through their own local savings, through their own capital markets, so weak domestic growth dynamic. However, I cannot discard one more phenomenon that has not to do with fundamentals, but with technicals, what the market called technicals, which implies contagion. And one particular source of concern from this technical factor is that a large proportion of investors are what is called crossover funds, rather than dedicated funds. And crossover funds are the ones that tend to run much faster than dedicated funds. And in emerging markets, most investors are crossover. And so that is another technical source that goes with the fundamentals. So let's look at a little bit of a comparison. I'm going to use like 4 or 5 slides using this same type of methodology, so let me explain it right now. I like very much to compare, I've been following this graph for years now, to compare where were emerging markets in 2007. Why in 2007? Because 2007 was the pre-global financial crisis. And looking at 2007, I knew what, if I were sitting in 2007, and if I have looked at the conditions, at the strength of emerging market, I could have pointed out which ones were going to do better than others, okay? So then I compare it with what's the situation now, or the latest data available, right? Because it has to be a comparison between countries. So the 45-degree line, it basically implies that in 2007 and now is really before the latest wave of problems. So it's basically after the first quarter of the year, okay, when I have data for all countries to make a comparison. So if I am in the 45-degree line, I'm in the same position, right? So the first one, I said that countries are going to stand a shock better depending on their financing needs, where their financing needs are very importantly reflected in the current account. And as Christine mentioned this morning, they have both trade and finance components. Well, if you look at the graph, the shadowed area have, on the left, I have the countries that are from Latin America, Asia, and South Africa. Africa is because it's South Africa there. And on the right-hand side, I have the Eastern European countries. If you look at the shadow area, that means that financing needs in the ones in the shadow areas are that they are in a worse position than they were in 2007. They have more needs to finance from external sources, okay? So that's the shadow area, which implies negative current account positions and deteriorating relative to before the global financial crisis. Notice that if you look at the Eastern European countries, they are better off, right? However, they are the ones that suffer the most, right? During the global financial crisis. All right, but now they are not. So it is more Latin America and Asia from this perspective. But you can look at many indicators and the story more or less goes in the same direction. For example, deteriorating fiscal positions have been the mirror image of these current account deficits in a number of countries. And again, if you look at the graph comparing 2007 and 2019 now, you see that the shadow area, most of the countries are now in the shadow area. And that's a flow dimension. But you can look also at a stock dimension. That's the fiscal balance, is the flow. The government debt is a stock variable. And what you look there is that, again, now to being a deteriorated position, countries have to be on the right of the 45-degree line, and that's where most countries are. The reason is that for all these happenings is that there was a big period of really capital inflows sustained that did not have this volatility, and many emerging markets did not take the opportunity to make the reforms that were needed to actually create the fiscal space that is needed now. Okay? So a number of countries actually do not have too much fiscal space to react to these spillovers that we are talking about. Now, this is just one more indicator. Again, talking about the stocks is another ratio, which is external debt. These are simple ratios, but they tell a lot. And again, most countries are now, I'm not focusing on any particular country, right? It's just the emerging market asset class. Most countries are to the right, implying a higher indebtedness to the world. I said that the second problem, or the second exposure, is how much is your indebtedness to external sector denominated in US dollars because of the dollar appreciation. And what happens is that there's a bit of a difference between what corporations are doing versus what governments are doing. But in terms of corporations, this is non-financial corporate debt, and that's the currency external debt, and this is total debt, because there is domestic currency too. This is the currency composition. And what you can see is that in the top countries, not surprisingly, Argentina is there first, right, with a huge debt denominated in US dollars. But what is interesting is that, again, most of Latin American countries are there too, on the top part, relatively speaking, when investors are looking at the composition of who's most exposure to dollar positions, open positions, which is another issue, because in many countries it's actually hard to know what is the total or the real level of hedging of corporations, okay? And that is an issue that needs to be dealt with. With government debt, the picture is less clear. there's not so much in the past. It used to be basically that the debt came from governments in the emerging markets, and they are the ones that were mostly denominated in foreign currency. But now it has shifted to being mostly on corporations as opposed to the government, which makes the situation a bit trickier. So I talk about vulnerabilities, but what about policy strengths, right? I mean, it's not that, okay, you're exposed, right? Okay, fine. But what about policy strength? And here, the most important strength to assess a balance between weaknesses and strengths is to know what is the reaction capacity of policymakers. And I just mentioned not very good news on the fiscal front because I don't see too much capacity of fiscal reaction, fiscal space without creating problems. However, on the monetary stance, interestingly, once again, because this has been happening for a long period now, including from advanced economies, is that central banks are in much better position to undertake at least countercyclical monetary policy. The graph that you have here shows the red lines are the policy rates and the blue lines are the inflation rates, and the dotted lines are the inflation band, the target. And as just 5 examples of countries, just not for picking anyone in particular, just to show the point, is that there are a number of countries which, with inflation in the band, and have started to react to these uncertainties in the international capital markets with declines in interest rates. Actually, most of the countries in the sample have already undertaken reductions as a countercyclical response. However, when you have a situation of high uncertainty and high volatility in international capital markets, and you have existing vulnerabilities in the countries, that by itself weakens the role of monetary policy. The capacity of through conventional decreases in interest rates, right? To actually be the force that is actually going to motivate increase in economic activity, or at least stop a decline in economic activity. And therefore, this calls for the use of complementary macroprudential policies. And very interestingly, that has been increasing significantly in emerging markets. The shadow area is the period of the global financial crisis. The red line is Latin America. The dotted blue is Asia, and Eastern Europe is the yellow one. So before the global financial crisis, Latin America was kind of was the leader in terms of use of macroprudential policies. But since the global financial crisis, both Asia and Eastern Europe have caught up. So basically all countries, or from different regions, I'm not saying all countries, but from different regions, are actually using this mechanism. But they use different instruments. These are macroprudential policies divided by 2 types. One is called borrowed-based. Borrowed-based is when you're trying to control or motivate the expansion of credit through policies that affect directly the behavior of the borrower. And Asia is actually using much more than Latin America and Eastern Europe those kind of policies, such as are on the slide examples, caps on loan to value and debt to income. On the other type of policy, which is policies on financial institutions, like countercyclical reserve requirements. By the way, China just declined reserve requirements yesterday or on Friday. But dynamic provisioning, countercyclical capital requirement, all those countercyclical policies are now being used similarly in all regions of the developing world. Another source of strength that is now weakening is a ratio that it was very common to follow, which is the ratio of short-term external debt to international reserves. As you know, the big difference between emerging markets and advanced economies, when I say the big difference, I mean in the financial sense, is that emerging markets don't issue hard currency, right? And so they do have to accumulate reserve, even if they claim they have a flexible exchange rate system, right? So for a long period of time and up to the beginning of the year, this ratio of short-term external debt to international reserves, countries were actually on the left of the 45-degree line, implying that they have more than sufficient a stock of international reserve to make good on their short-term obligations with the international community. However, something interesting has started to happen. The graph on the right is what market participants believe is going to be the ratio by the end of the year. Because a number of countries, given these continuous outflows or this continuous increase in spreads, although they correct, as Julio said, but they still happen, they have been losing reserves. And the market is projecting that they will be losing more reserves. And so now, if you look at the projections, that's not what is happening now. Now, many countries are actually moving, this is a forecast only, to the right of the 45-degree line, which, again, means that, as in the past, the holding of international reserve may actually be, and is expected by the market, the variable that the economic variable, the economic fundamental, that could be playing the major role in facing these given vulnerabilities, in facing these shocks that come from advanced economies. So much is the case that in the literature, for example, Oliver Jane and José de Gregorio have argued several times in the past that central banks have relied much more on the accumulation of international reserve management, increasing them in good times and using them in bad times, than any kind of capital flow management, including capital control. And on purpose, the graph on Brazil is there, because Brazil is kind of the known country for capital controls. However, as you can see in the relationship, it's a very close relationship between the movement of reserves and the movement of capital flows. So reserves seems to be the instrument that is actually perceived by the market as is going to be used as the first defense. And this is important, particularly important now, because, and it has been discussed in previous sessions too, that the global safety net have weakened significantly. Remember that during the global financial crisis, there were the extension of the Fed swap credit lines to a number of systemic important countries, including Brazil and Mexico, that could have faced a severe problem without those credit lines. Okay, I don't think that those credit lines are available to emerging markets these days. And so much more the reliance on self-insurance becomes much more important. There is one recommendation from a group that I chair that is called the Committee on Latin America Macro and Economic Issues, with a number of very well Latin American economists like Carmen Reinhardt, Guillermo Calvo, José Gregorio, etc. And there, we have a recommendation which is very unconventional about the use of reserves. And this is lacking, if you are in the situation when lacking the global safety nets that could have been present in other situations, and facing a tightening in monetary conditions, perhaps international reserve could be used in an unorthodox way to facilitate foreign currency funding to critical sectors, and I mean exports. That actually, this is an experiment that actually took place in 2002 in Brazil. And so it's an unconventional and it's there to be tried, but that's where emerging markets are now. So I haven't talked about flexible exchange rates. What about the strength of flexible exchange rates? Yes, they are there. Yes, they are huge shock absorbers. And actually, when there is a debate, and there's always a debate in emerging markets about the extent of flexibility of the exchange rates, and a question that I always face is that, come on, look at this. Flexible exchange rate is a solution for everything because look at how huge depreciations emerging markets have faced since in these waves of since 2013, since the temper tantrum, there has been waves of huge depreciations, and you see no financial crisis. And not everywhere, right? Because you had the problem of Turkey, now you have Argentina, and Brazil did not have a financial crisis per se, but has a huge recession. Okay. But however, the argument is that this shows the benefits of flexible exchange rate as shock absorbers. I agree, but one has to remember something. All these shocks have been happening in the context of ample global liquidity. And again, only recently, this differentiation between countries have started to take place. Before, it was free extension of credit. I don't mean by free, well, almost free given the interest rates in the market, but without really discrimination between the different countries as much as necessary for a proper evaluation. So the appetite for risk in the international capital markets has changed dramatically. Now, there is much more emphasis on idiosyncratic risk and looking at country by country as opposed as the emerging asset class as a whole. So it's not that I'm trying to reduce the effectiveness or the importance and usefulness of flexible exchange rates. What I'm saying is that for governments or corporations that are facing the combination of two things, high refinancing needs and important currency mismatches, and the two are very common in a number of countries, then a sharp depreciation of the currency if there is a huge tightening in liquidity, which I translate as an increased risk aversion. It could happen even at low interest rates. That's my point, okay? It doesn't have to occur through a huge increase in interest rate, might prove having very adverse consequences on emerging markets. So, if one combines strengths and vulnerabilities, right? If one puts both of them together, it's very hard. But still, let's try something, and I'll finish in so what if we construct what I call a resilience indicator and try to see how countries are ranked? And this is, I'm not going to explain this indicator, it's published, so you can look at it if you wish. But basically describes the kind of variables I've been discussing and has two dimensions, right? One dimension is how well are you standing when a shock hits you? So if you're standing strong and somebody hits you, well, you go like this and come back. If you are weak, meaning your fundamentals are weak, you can fall down. But the second dimension is once you stand a shock, the capacity of react to the shock. And the reaction of the shock is basically through the policies of the authorities, monetary and fiscal policy mostly, but of course others too. Well, very quickly, this is what I get if I compare 2017 with now. Countries in orange are Latin American countries, the gray countries are Asian countries, and the yellow countries are Eastern Europe. Notice that in 2007, okay, so if you go to the index goes to weak to strongest, okay? So, and this is a relative, not an absolute, so it's a comparison. But notice that by 2007, if you were in 2007, you could have said that the problem was going to be a problem in Eastern Europe, just looking at very few variables. All the yellow countries are the ones that were the least resilient in 2007. That's the important thing, before the crisis. If you now go to 2019, however, the story is there's not a region-specific stories. Now what you have is the countries spilled all over the place, and look at poor Argentina, right? I mean, it has really, really, really weakened, but there's not a specific country stories. Vulnerabilities are for now idiosyncratic. So, and this is my last transparency, because I cannot finish without this. I mentioned growth dynamics. At the end of the day, what happened is that if you lack sufficient drivers from the motors for growth internally, And every evidence shows that, at least in regions like Latin America, productivity growth have actually declined, meaning that potential growth has actually declined. So if you are lacking those modes of growth, it's going to be much harder to face a slowdown from the global economy. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Liliana. Now we have Alejandro Díaz de León, the governor of the Bank of Mexico. Mexico has been at the forefront of many problems, further than that now. They were the head of the banking crisis of the 80s, then the tequila crisis of 1994, 95. But now, fortunately, we have Alejandro, who's going to step up for us.
Thank you. Thank you, Julio. First, let me say thanks to Pablo, al Banco de España, and the Reinventing Bretton Woods Committee for inviting me to the panel. And let me start saying that I think the spillovers, and also for putting spillovers in top of the agenda next to the global imbalances narrative, I think it is very important to be mindful of both. I think spillovers are a side effect of integration. I think we should not second-guess integration because of the spillovers. I think we need to manage spillovers and have a successful integration. But I agree with some of the conclusions of the previous panel. I'll have three main areas that I would like to cover. First is there has been a very significant or a deeper integration of emerging markets into global financial markets. Second, I'll talk about some recent trends in the global financial markets and some of the spillovers that we're currently facing in emerging markets. And third, some snapshot of the case of Mexico this time around. This is a graph we all know, but I think it is important to have in context that as monetary policy in advanced economies, both in terms of interest rates and QE, significantly stimulative after the great financial crisis, well, that triggered a stronger financial integration with emerging markets. Probably before the crisis, portfolios were underinvested in emerging markets, and that process was significantly accelerated as a side effect of these stimulative monetary policies. To what extent these flows have been material? And the first graph are the EPFR data about flows to emerging markets, both for fixed income and for equity. And you can see the size of these flows, very significant. And in terms of what has been non-residence holdings of government bonds in local currency, you can see that, and precisely Julio was mentioning this, that this was accelerated after the crisis and precisely with this monetary policy in advanced economies and this search for yield. In LATAM and in emerging Europe and also in South Africa, you have seen a growing share of foreigners' holdings of local currency debt. The third element of this part is basically risk appetite. Global risk appetite has been a very strong effect, has had a very strong effect on both fixed income and in equities in emerging markets. The first graph, it's basically depicting a global risk aversion index and MB spreads, and you can see the close link that that risk aversion index has with MB spreads. And the second one is emerging markets volatility in equities markets, in ETFs markets, which follows very closely the VIX volatility of the S&P 500. So very linked both in terms of fixed income and in terms of equities markets. Now let me go into what we have been facing in the last year or so. The first element is clearly we have seen lower global growth. I think that's very clear. From the second graph, you can see that has implied a significant reduction in world trade volume, in industrial production, and also in manufacturing PMIs. So global growth is lower. We have had, as a consequence of that, as a side effect of that, lower inflationary pressures, both for headline CPI, and that also includes the energy component associated with declining commodity prices as aggregate demand globally has been going down, and also less pressures on core inflation, as you can see from the graph to the right. In terms of interest rates, and we all know the story, there has been a sharp revision on the expectation of short-term interest rates in advanced economies. That's the first graph. And in the second and the third, you can see the 2-year interest rates in advanced economies and the 10-year with a very sharp compression and a very sharp reduction on interest rates. Well, under this context of lower growth, lower inflationary pressures, and lower interest rates, what has been the dynamic on emerging markets? First, we have also experienced a compression throughout the yield curve. The first graph, which is the 10-year sovereign bonds for a selected group of emerging market economies, you can see that there has been a very sharp compression throughout this year of interest rates. And in the second graph, that's a chart of the WGBI, and in an inverted scale, the US Treasury interest rates. And obviously, you can see that as rates in the US have gone down, the WGBI, this local currency index, has been increasing in value. So there has been significant returns from this lower compression in yields in these instruments. And in the graph to the right, you can see that it has been basically inflows into fixed income markets, in emerging fixed income markets, what you have seen throughout this year. So the first is we have a trend of lower growth, lower inflationary pressures, and a compression of yields, both in the advanced economy space and also in emerging markets. But that is not exempt from volatility episodes and risk aversion episodes or flight to quality episodes. In this graph, I depict, this is an emerging markets currency index in the first graph, and we depict a story count on Google for the two-word trade war. And as you can see, when the trade war has heightened, you can see significant flight to quality and a movement and an adjustment in the exchange rates. This adjustment has not been hand in hand with an increase or pressure on local yield curves. This time around, we have seen, again, the ongoing trend of lower growth, lower inflation, lower yield curves, but these volatility episodes, very acute in some countries, that have been associated mainly with the trade war narrative. And we have also seen in emerging markets, I think these last months have been characterized for a weak outlook for equities markets. And you can see that both in the second and in the third graph. So the overall summary of what we've been getting throughout this year, it has been an overall trend, which is depicted in the first graph, which is basically lower yields, lower interest rates throughout the yield curve, and volatility episodes that have been characterized by volatility in the exchange rate, depreciation on the exchange rate, and with a weak performance by also equities markets. Now let me go to what have been some of the recent trends in the case of Mexico. This is a graph of the peso-dollar exchange rate. And as you can see, there are basically 3 structural breaks. This is the standard structural breaks exercises. One of them is throughout the great financial crisis. The second one is associated basically with a sharp reduction in commodity prices. In the case of Mexico, we are significantly less exposed to commodity prices than other LATAM economies, but not necessarily on the fiscal accounts. And this time around, the problem was maximized with a reduction in oil prices and also a sharp reduction in oil production volumes. That exacerbated and made things worse. And also it coincides with the NAFTA uncertainty that induced a structural break on the exchange rate. But looking at the magnitude of this graph, I think it's very clear that in the case of Mexico, the exchange rate has worked as a shock absorber. And in spite of having the foreigners' holdings being increased. I think it got stuck again. If we come forward to the next slide. In the case of Mexico, and part of what that slide and the rest of those slides are going to show is that we have already experiencing significant shocks. Some of them, the traditional commodity shocks, that basically entailed a very sharp reversal of trends. When you thought about Mexico's external accounts for decades, you would have said an oil trade surplus, a non-oil trade deficit. Since 2015, that has been reverted. Now we have a sharp oil trade deficit and a non-oil trade surplus. That required a significant real exchange rate adjustment, as was perceived in the first graph. And we also needed to reduce the current account deficit because we had lower sources of external finance. Basically, they were on average in 2013 and 14, a little bit north of 4 percentage points of GDP. On average, on the last 4 years, it has been around 1 percentage point of GDP or a little less than that. Now, this graph tries to put into perspective the size of the real exchange rate depreciation that the Mexican peso has experienced. This is a graph that starts in 78, all the way up to this year. And you can see in the first graph is the bilateral real exchange rate between Mexico and the United States. And you can see that depreciations north of 30% were only present in 82, 87, and 95. And those were crisis episodes and crisis years in Mexico. This time around, we have seen a real exchange rate depreciation of around 30%. And as you can see in the graph to the right, but a very significant or a contrasting difference of the nominal system of the economy. You can see the combination of exchange rate depreciation and headline inflation. You can see in the early 80s, a depreciation north of 200%, inflations north of 100% in 87. And this time around, we're having a more orderly adjustment of the nominal system of the economy in virtue of the floating exchange rate and having monetary policy anchoring inflation expectations and working to abate potential second round effects from the FX adjustment. Now, we have not been out of trouble in the last years, and one of them was this recomposition of the external accounts. The other one related with the uncertainty regarding NAFTA, and also more recently, also domestic sources of uncertainty. There has been a change of administration and a change of priorities and a change in style. And it can be illustrated with the first graph. By the exchange rate, the red line is the Mexican peso exchange rate, and the blue line, it's a synthetic composition for the peso using an emerging market basket. And as you can see, clearly the trade tensions was basically one of the key elements that induced a very sharp adjustment in the peso, and they have been converging towards the end. But nonetheless, this clearly illustrates that the uncertainty regarding the sustainability of the external accounts, we all thought NAFTA was part of the landscape. It was not the case. That introduced significant uncertainty and introduced an adjustment on the exchange rate, and as you can see from the other graph, also into credit default swaps. And there has been a gap between the credit default swaps since the beginning of 2017. Now, in terms of foreigners' portfolio and going into the elements of vulnerability and so on, here we can see that there are $250 billion US dollars invested in Mexico in fixed income and in equities market. So financial investment, which is literally liquidity, less than 24 hours, in a very sizable amount, $250 billion US dollars. It has been relatively resilient, as you can see, in spite of the volatility, in spite of the shocks. And this has required that the macro strategy gets doubled down, and you need to basically reinforce the strength of the fiscal strategy, monetary policy, and the resilience of the financial sector. And in the graph to the right, that graph is what it's called carry to risk, which is the 3-month interest rate differential of the peso treasury bonds, Treasury against the US Treasury security at 3 months, adjusted by the volatility of options, the FX options. And as you can see, Mexico, before this NAFTA concern, or even as this trade war or trade tension with Mexico has started, you can see that Mexico was trading significantly below the emerging market average. And as you can see, as this uncertainty started to unravel, we started having a premium, and this is basically monetary policy adjusting for several things. One is risk premia. I think risk appetite and risk premia are important elements to be mindful of. And the other, we had a sharp increase on inflation associated with the exchange rate dynamics and increase in domestic gasoline prices, basically to cope with the fiscal challenge associated with the reduction in oil production. But as you can see, we have had for quite some time, we have been having a higher return or a higher expected carry to risk return vis-a-vis the average of emerging markets. This means basically we have been trying to keep attractive the Mexican peso securities as an attractive destination for investment. And these graphs are basically constructed with options information. You basically depict the 1 year ahead implied distribution for the Mexican peso. And you do that, basically we're comparing two dates. One is before all of these uncertainty unraveled, which is the June 30th, 2014. And the other one is a very recent one in September 4th this year. And as you can see in the first graph, you see that it was moved towards the left. So more depreciation anticipated in the Mexican peso. That means a more risky environment for the peso. The second graph depicts a 1 year ahead implied distribution for the Mexican government bond returns. If you invest in 1 year, 2 year, up to 10 years, and you basically ride the yield curve, what would be your expected return measured in local currency? And you can see the shift in June 30, 2014, against the most recent one, September 4. So there has been an increase in the expected return in pesos from investing in fixed income. And when you combine both of them, you get the distribution to the right, which is basically we have had an increase or a little bit more attractive return distribution from the September this year vis-a-vis the June 30th, 2014. So the message of this graph is Mexico peso has been gotten riskier. We have had to increase the return and the attractiveness of fixed income instruments. Not only the short end, also the rest of the yield curve has required an additional return. And when you combine a riskier exchange rate with those returns, overall, we have been able to have an attractive ex-ante destination in Mexico peso holdings. But I think this illustrates how both idiosyncratic shocks or global spillovers, either from trade tensions or from other sources, can have an effect on your returns, and that is a serious element that you have to filter when you decide policy. There was another slide. It got stuck again. It's only 2 slides. I'll be quick. Next. There you go. This is just to depict the 10-year average term premium in peso bonds vis-a-vis the 10-year both term premium and treasury yields. And you can see that they are very, very linked. So at the end of the day, what happens in the US being the epicenter of the financial the epicenter of the world financial market, it is obviously very important for the term premium and for the returns in our yield curves. And I'll very quickly about some of the challenges and opportunities. I think that a more integrated and global financial markets entails challenges and opportunities. Clearly, open capital accounts can bring much needed resources for growth and development and promote developing financial markets. Recipient economies need a strong and resilient macroeconomic fundamentals, and this goes hand in hand with what was mentioned before. It is essential to bolster the resilience of the financial system to outflows. A stable domestic financial system and a sounder borrower balance sheet may help to reduce both the likelihood and the impact of flow reversals. We need deeper financial markets with a strong domestic investor base that could help offset selling pressures from volatile global risk appetite. I think systemic economic central banks need to consider spillback effects of their actions, and this clearly is related to trade tensions. Transparent policy processes and clearly communicated actions can reduce the risk of market and capital flow volatility, and managing financial market expectations, I think, has become even more critical. We are facing a polarized environment in both advanced economies and emerging markets. Short-term policies have been adopted, putting political pressure on multilateral and domestic institutions, including central banks. Much-needed structural reforms and adequate long-term policies have been absent in several of our countries, while escalating geopolitical and trade tensions have put additional pressure on central banks' aggregate demand management responsibilities, increasing the challenges and trade-offs of monetary policy. I think we need to manage spillovers, not go in the other direction. We need to mitigate their risks, but clearly go forward in terms of integration. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alejandro. Mexico has been very fortunate in having very good central bank governors. Probably all of you know Agustín Carsten, Guillermo Ortiz. But I was remembering an old guy who was governor from 1950 to the late 60s, Rodrigo Gómez. One professor of Chicago, probably you, Jacob, know pretty well. Harvard used to say Mexico was lucky. They had Rodrigo Gómez and no oil in the 50s and 60s. They didn't have Rodrigo Gómez and they had oil. And everything went down the slope.
Now we don't have oil anymore.
But you have Alejandro. Now we have Beratai. Beratai is the governor of Bank of Thailand. As you have seen the numbers put forward by Liliana, Thailand appears as the country more resilient, probably for if there's a new event now. Beratai is also going to talk about how to deal with these spillovers. Thank you, Beratai, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Julio. Very good afternoon to everyone. Very, very delighted to be here. Many thanks to Pablo, Bank of Spain, and the Reform Bretton Woods Committee for organizing this conference. When we look at the title of this panel, Managing the Permanence of Spillovers, two types of spillovers come to my mind. One is the spillover on the trade tension. Thailand, being part of the East Asian supply chains, we have been affected quite significantly. But this issue will continue to evolve over time. And now we're experiencing trade diversion, relocation of production base, and I think that will take some time. The second type of spillover is a financial spillover. I think I focus more on the financial spillover. And both Alejandro and Liliana, you have very nicely demonstrated the changing patterns of capital flows to emerging markets. I think this is a new normal that we have to deal with. We very much hope that spillover, financial spillover would be transitory, but as the title of this session is a permanence of spillover. So it also requires a lot of thinking in the overall framework, not only for the central banks on the recipient ends, but also the international financial institutions that have much influence on the framework, on how we look at this issue of spillovers. 3 points that I would like to highlight. First, as reflected in the very first panel of today, capital flows now account for a much larger portion of cross-border flows than current account flows, and have much larger effects on exchange rates of emerging markets. And flows into emerging markets are often caused by factors beyond emerging markets' control. As Julio mentioned, we don't know what tweet message will come out at night, and that has triggered capital flows into emerging markets. The volume of portfolio flows to emerging markets and the volatility of cross-border flows increased markedly post-global financial crisis. And we have to deal with portfolio flows that are not proportionate to the size of our foreign exchange market. This is a big issue. It has big implication on the exchange rates. I'll give you one number. If you compare flows roughly the decade before the GFC and the decade after the GFC, FDI flow, foreign direct investment to emerging market, increased by about double, but portfolio flows increased by more than tenfold. And this is the new environment that we have to deal with. Capital flows also seem to be more sensitive to global financial conditions, which is dictated largely by monetary policy stance of advanced economies. They're not as much influenced by the textbook determinants that we use to, like interest rate differentials or macroeconomic conditions of the recipient countries. In our case, when Julio and your chart indicate that we are among one of the resilient economies, so we tend to receive a lot of safe haven flows and also a lot of rebalancing flows when there's a rebalancing among emerging markets, and that do not fit nicely with interest rate differentials. Our policy rate is at 1.5, it's the lowest among emerging markets, and we have also been affected badly by the trade tension. But the financial market seems to think that we are safe haven and attracting a lot of flows. So the large capital flows to emerging markets, I think, could lead to many undesirable consequences, such as asset price surge, underpricing of risks, and also credit growth that pose financial stability risks in recipient countries. We have seen financial conditions in Asian emerging markets that have loosened over the years. We have seen credit to non-financial sector growing at an alarming rate in some emerging markets. We have seen stocks price earning ratios going up, long-term yield curves has flattened, and also credit spread has come down substantially, despite the fact that risks have gone up over the past few years. And this leads me to my second point, that when countries, emerging markets, look at these issues, we have to be mindful that each country is very different, and dealing with capital flow spillover must take into account country-specific matters. Not all emerging markets are alike, and some may have large current account surplus, some may have large current account deficit, some may rely a lot on external finance and by other exporters of financing. And with the changing capital flow dynamics and foreign exchange speculation, it is inevitable that exchange rate movements at times become an amplifier of capital flows, not stabilizer of capital flows. We often think, in the traditional textbooks that if you allow floating exchange rate, that could serve very well as a stabilizer of capital flows. But in many episodes, floating exchange rate could also be amplifier of capital flows. Appreciation leads to expectation of more appreciation, particularly now the trading activities are done by non-residents in offshore markets. And that could have changed the foreign exchange dynamics that amplify capital flows. In the case of Thailand, as highlighted in your chart, we have relatively large structural current account surplus. We have very low dependence on foreign financing, low currency mismatch, and large international reserves. So the Thai baht has been considered as a safe haven currency among emerging markets currencies. So we have to deal with significant speculative inflows, especially those wishing to park short-term money in Thai baht assets. So many episodes of appreciation leading to more inflows and also more appreciation. And these episodes of capital inflows have definitely complicated monetary policy framework of emerging market countries. Central banks need to balance multiple objectives with limited tools. We have to balance between price stability, economic growth, and also financial stability. So the importance of having combinations of policy tools on our menu list is very important, ranging from interest rate policies, macroprudential measures, capital flow management measures, and foreign exchange intervention, to be able to deal with the diverse sources of shock, which require flexibility for emerging market central banks to be able to mix and match different types of policy tools. And this brings me to my third point, which is that imbalance analysis must be done with country-specific context. And this is reflections of our dealing with international financial institutions Sometimes we forget that countries are very different, and we can't measure countries by using the same standard ruler. International financial institutions and institutional views, international frameworks on measuring global imbalances, like the external balance assessment, have tendency to use the same standard. It's more like a one-size-fits-all framework. And particularly on external balance assessments and also on assessment on currency valuation. However well-intended, in the current geopolitical environment, it can be easily twisted and for geopolitical purpose, and that has restricted countries from the much-needed flexibility to utilize a combination of policy tools. In this context, we very much welcome the IMF move towards integrated policy framework to look at the possibility of combining different policy tools in the context of different settings of country, as opposed to having institutional view looking at a policy measure by policy measure. To conclude, I think we need to collectively rethink of tools and frameworks underpinning the international financial system. And if I may offer three points. Firstly, the assessment of global imbalances, external balance assessments and implications for currency valuation assessment need to move away from current account-centric view. And in particular, now the trade balance-centric view. We need to take into account the changing landscape of capital flows. As I mentioned earlier, capital flows are much larger than current account flows nowadays. And capital flows have much larger impacts on exchange rate movement. Structural changes, there are also a lot of structural changes in emerging markets that affect how people save and how people invest. And there is also a growing service component that we don't know exactly how to measure that, particularly modern services. So the assessments of global imbalances, the framework of thinking how to assess external balance assessment, I think need to be adapted along the line of the changing environment. We also need to have a much better understanding of foreign exchange market dynamics. Because exchange rate could serve as amplifier of shocks as opposed to stabilizer of shocks. And the foreign exchange market dynamic has changed completely. Now we talk about Mr. Algo dictating foreign exchange rate of emerging markets. We have had many series of flash crash, also including emerging market currencies. So that's one point on the assessments of global imbalances. We need to have a better framework to assess external balance assessment. Secondly, within the international monetary system, a burden of adjustments needs to be proportionately shared by the source and recipient countries of capital flows. This is spillover and also spillback that Alejandro touched upon. At present, emerging markets which are on the receiving ends of capital flows, we tend to bear all the burdens of the adjustments, and often we are restricted and reproached in our response to large capital flows, while advanced economies or the source countries have much flexibility in their conduct of monetary policies. And thirdly, on policy toolkits, especially foreign exchange intervention and capital flow management measures need to be sufficiently flexible to allow emerging markets to be able to navigate volatile capital flows and able to to deploy measures targeted at the source of capital flows. So these are three points for the international framework. But looking ahead, the situation we find ourselves in right now could lead to gradual, unintentional, competitive easing of monetary policy and unintentional competitive devaluation, if I may, because of concerns on exchange rate. When advanced economy central banks ease their monetary policy further to prop up the slump economy, emerging markets find ourselves forced to follow suit in order to cope with not only economic slowdown, but also financial spillovers that might come with additional excess liquidity put into the global financial markets by advanced economies. And this will put pressure on the exchange rate of emerging markets. All of these come at a time when degree of leverage is very high. The corporate debts are also at historic high. So I believe that there should be collaborations among central banks. I use the word collaboration. It's not the same degree of coordination that Jacob mentioned, but I think it should be stronger than cooperation of sharing information. And there are three key areas of collaboration. First, among the central bankers, we often think about policy space, and we often talk about limited policy space. But when we talk about limited policy space, we think of two dimensions. One is the interest rate, whether it's zero lower bound or effective lower bound. And that's one dimension on how much interest rates that we have left to be able to deploy. And the second dimension is on the balance sheet of the central bank. Many central banks have expanded their balance sheet significantly, and they have increased their shares in domestic financial market. The other dimension which I think is missing is the financial stability lower bound. How much financial stability risks can we accept when we make decisions to ease our monetary policy further? I think that dimension is not as well appreciated when central banks make decisions on monetary policy. And given interest rate has been low for long and will continue to be low, if you look at the amount of bonds that are traded with the negative rates now, it's unbelievable, right? And we continue to increase how much financial stability risks that will entail. So I think financial stability concerns has to be incorporated more robustly in the monetary policy frameworks. Secondly, central banks must have a collective voice on how much central banks can do and to what extent further monetary easing can prop up the economy in the current environment. It's very difficult for each central bank to talk in our domestic context that there's so much we can do, and that would undermine the credibility of each central bank. But collectively, we can have a collective voice of how much central bank and monetary policy can do, so that the market would have a realistic view and not expect the central banks to engage in excessive easing that could lead to unintentional competitive devaluation, which no one will gain. The focus should be on structural policies, fiscal policies, and also policies to collect the misguided policy, particularly on trade. And the last point on central banks collaboration, each country has to handle different forms of challenges from capital flow spillover. We should continue to support the work of international financial institutions on the integrated policy framework, and this will increase flexibility, especially for small open economies. Advanced economies and also emerging market economies, if they are small open economies, I think we face similar issues. We need to be able to respond to spillovers more effectively according to the context of each country, and be able to have combinations of policies on our menu list. You need to avoid analytical framework, institutional view, and currency valuation assessments that could be twisted or misused in the current geopolitical environment. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brete. I have been allowed We are almost running out of time. I have been allowed the moderator. I can say uncertainty is here to stay, probably. Even if we have very good indicators, you never know about a new political outcome, and that trade tensions may increase. It's very hard to know. But one thing that is pretty different from some years ago is that market seems to distinguish between countries much and much more. I remember when Lula was elected, or Lula was about to be elected, actually almost every Latin American country was suffering a lot of pressure on their exchange rates. Now Argentina, Venezuela, not at all. Even Turkey, it might move the market for half an hour, then nothing. It seems that people are know more details about each market. They have invested more money. and they distribute pretty well these countries. But if you will have to bet, I probably will have expansionary monetary policy for the year to come, with volatility because of trade tensions. But you will have to bet. One could bet that probably, if there continue to be this search for yield, the price of assets in emerging markets are going to be higher, the yields are going to be lower, and probably on average you will have more inflows and probably some appreciation, at least for the countries that behave well, let us say. But that is very uncertain. And what Liliana Rojas was talking about is liquidity. Actually, this is not much of a problem now. The problem is when this old phrase called sudden step, when markets and if fear it goes only one way, everybody wants to sell, there are some problems, but even that has changed a little bit. What we have seen, talking with those that buy our bonds, for example, just to mention some numbers, I don't want to talk about my country, but before the tapering, 61% of the bonds were in hands of foreigners. It went down to 1/3, now it's around 54% again. When I talk to those that hold the treasury papers, most of them want to have exposure to the country and to the currency. Of course, they will try to hedge if they believe there is going to be a depreciation, but they don't want just to sell at any price. And one big change, and I have seen in many countries, Chile, Peru, Colombia, probably Mexico, so private pension funds have more and more money abroad. In our case, about 50% of the assets of the private pension funds are abroad. So as soon as they see an opportunity to have an attractive price of the bonds, they enter the market. So actually, it's better for my pension at the end, but actually they tend to stabilize the market a little bit. But I don't know, it has changed a little bit. It became more a conventional asset class with a lot of volatility. Veratag has suggested some measures to intervene. If there is a bigger problem, as Liliana mentioned, there are not going to be swap lines from the Fed. The IMF is working on some swap lines, but they are so small that they will not be enough for the intervention of the Bank of Thailand, the Bank of Peru for 1 hour even, no? Because the IMF has too few resources now for the magnitude of the problem. But I want to know, if you have to bet what will happen to our currencies 2 years from now, what will be your answer? And then we go to some questions for the public. We have very few minutes.
Maybe I'll start just very quickly.
Sure.
The peso-dollar exchange rate has $100 billion of a daily turnover.
Yeah.
80% of that is on external hands. To influence that market is very hard.
Sure.
Sometimes it's better not to make the exit larger, to leave FX risk on the investor. I think the investor has matured and they hold that risk. We have had more than 30% real exchange rate depreciation without an outflow, a massive outflow. And I think that highlights that sometimes not intervening and not providing an exit strategy is the best way.
Perfect. Elena?
Yeah, well, you ask an extremely difficult question, especially because economists know very little about where exchange rates are going to be. But something that you hear in the markets a lot is that they are overexposed to the emerging market asset class. That during the boom years of emerging markets, basically going from 2004 to 2014, there was, as you were saying, an indiscriminated inflows, and at that time there was an overpositioning. So now what you see is inflows taking into account the differential, of course, because they want to make money, but at the same time at a slower pace. So what you would expect is that, those inflows could be increasing when good news come or bad news, or as you were saying, or interest rates in the United States remain low, and in Europe certainly are going to remain low for a long time. But the big question behind that is, but countries, are they really doing the homework that is needed to actually face the increased risk that could be taken by those increased inflows? Because if the answer is no, if potential growth is coming down, then, and this is very consistent with what you were saying in your recommendation about taking into account the financial instabilities that could be creating when making monetary policy decisions, then those inflows are going to keep the party going on. But the party usually stops. And people are talking about where is the next recession in the United States coming out?
Sure.
And yeah, we have a decade and no recession. So does that mean that recessions have disappeared? No, we are just in a very long cycle that started in the global financial crisis. That's my view, that we're still in the same cycle because the resolution has been taken with a word that has become very popular now, which is let's do everything on a slow pace. Just gradualism. Very gradual. Yeah, very gradual. You actually don't undertake the corrections that are needed, these real corrections. So I couldn't answer your question about where the exchange rates are going to be, but I can't. There's no way I can answer that question. But what I can tell you is that if exchange rates, interest rates remain very low in advanced economies for a long time, and emerging markets get the sensation, the feeling, the perception that those are good times, I think that's a mistake.
But you have an answer.
I mean, this is a question that I get asked every day in Bangkok because the Thai baht has appreciated by about 6% against US dollar, and our nominal effective exchange rate has appreciated a lot. So it's a big concern among the exporters. My answer is that, I don't know.
Yes.
I don't know the direction of the exchange rate. I know only that the volatility will increase. Okay, I can't tell about the direction. I can tell just only the magnitude of volatility. The reasons I'm saying that when we talk about exchange rates, it's two sides of the same coin, right? Nobody knows what's going to happen with the Federal Reserves, with the ECB, or with President Trump's policies on trade tension. And that will have implications on the value of US dollars. Secondly, as Alejandro mentioned, the dynamics of the foreign exchange market is very large, and a lot of transactions are done outside our country. I'll give you an example. During the last week of August, when President Trump announced further tariffs on China, all Asian currency depreciated, with the exception of Japanese yen and Thai baht. And we appreciated quite significantly because of the safe haven flows that occurred. And lastly, on the point that you made, Julio, about investors appear to differentiate across emerging market currencies. I think yes and no. Now we see a lot more investors that are passive funds. The size of the ETF and passive funds have grown significantly, and they tend to follow the same benchmarks. And we might see some rebalancing among emerging markets within the emerging markets asset class. But I think those who spend time and invest in understanding about real situation of each country, I think that has come down.
We have about 2 or 3 minutes for questions from the public. Alicia, please. Here. Yes.
Question on the elephant in the room. It would seem, and this is rightly the case so far, that the only thing that matters is the Fed or the strength of the dollar. But this year, China has entered the MSCI index, the Bloomberg, Barclays index. Things got at the right time because they were doing expansionary monetary policies. Rates were going down. There was an expectation of renminbi depreciation, which actually happened to be right. So I guess it didn't attract so much capital. But imagine that this were to turn, and if I just have these numbers in mind, from 10 trillion in imports to 30 trillion in imports, just Xi Jinping's announcement at the Shanghai Expo, where's that money going to come? And what's the impact on EM? Because this is a big spillover. This could be a massive change in the turn of liquidity, let alone the Fed is independent not fully independent, but it's kind of a shock that I don't think we are kind of taking into account.
You have,
Piroska Nagymohácsi, I'm from the London School of Economics. Thank you so very much for an excellent panel, very, very insightful, and with some very useful analytical charts as well. My question would be to Liliana, referring to one of your very important points, and I don't want to have it passed because it's so important, your observation, the very active use of international reserves as a new emerging tool in emerging markets. That is borne out by some additional research in addition to yours. A recent paper by Ishlitsky, also from LSE, shows that actually most of the countries are not floaters. They are really, to some extent, fixers. And they have the same he said the same observation as you, that they use very actively international reserves all year instead of capital controls. So how you see this trade-off? And is it really true? Is it just a question of reserves, or should we think more actively also of capital flow management, which is the elegant word for especially for capital flow. Capital flow management, when the reserves are no longer there, when the self-insurance is no longer enough, where the global safety. So what are your thoughts about capital flow management, and maybe the other panel members?
May we have the last question? The two last questions. Here, Jacob Frecken, and then behind.
Thank you. I also enjoyed the presentations very much, a lot of stuff. At the beginning, there was a classification of the nature of spillovers, the trade area, the financial area. And I wonder if I can also introduce another channel of spillover, which is more difficult to define, a spillover of bad ideas. It's a serious remark. After all, there are very few policy makers relatively to market participants. So it's enough that 2, 3, 4 major policy makers, especially if they are big, set a tone, and in a way, new consensus emerges. And I wonder if there is a mechanism other than coffee breaks to deal a little bit with it. Maybe it is a question that does not need an answer. I want to say one thing about the capital flows, capital flow management. I already hinted where I stand about it. My approach about it is not dogmatic. It reflects failure of attempts. In other words, even if you believe that you can do good with it systematically, those who tried to do it systematically did not really succeed. Mm-hmm. But the leftover outcome was not just the fact that we are back at square zero, but rather we affect fundamentally the behavior of financial markets. When the central bank or the government intervenes in the market, it is not just another player. This is the elephant in the in the shop. And in this regard, it really can affect systematically the pricing of risk and everything of that type. And it does not need to intervene. It's enough that there is the potential of intervention, that the character of pricing in the market and risks in the market is affected. I am concerned about it. The very fact that we needed to change our vocabulary in order to sound a little better, away from capital controls to capital account management, means that we felt deeply that something is bothering us and we will need something nicer, but I'm still worried about it. Thank you.
And the last question, please.
A quick question to take advantage of some of the expertise on the panel. There's another elephant in the room, perhaps, which is the evolution of the IMF's program towards Argentina. How would the panelists assess the impact on other emerging markets of the choice between a reprofiling, as has been proposed, of Argentina's external bonded debt and a deeper restructuring?
We start with you, Alejandro, or Olivia?
¿Y yo comienzo?
Sí, como quieras.
Okay.
Short, brief, Elena.
That's hard. Okay, so I'll take two of the questions. On your question of international reserves and capital controls, actually, countries don't like to use capital controls. I had mentioned in the presentation too that a big difference between emerging markets and advanced economies is that the emerging markets cannot issue hard currency. So when you don't issue hard currency, it's very, very hard to actually have independent monetary policy at all moments in time. Very hard. So actually holding of reserves, but to me holding of reserves or having liquidity is the same thing. Actually, I'm having a research paper going on right now that shows that countries that are more liquid in terms that they have accumulated sufficient, and forget about the definition of sufficient, liquidity in terms of accumulation of reserves, float more in good times. So they actually, not being an issuer of hard currency, they mimic having hard currency by accumulating these reserves that actually are going to give them the potential capacity to, float. So you cannot float because you don't have reserves, and that's something that distinguishes emerging markets from the rest. On the reprofiling of the debt in IMF and Argentina, I have a very bad joke about Argentina. There are no Argentinians here, so I'll repeat it. And it goes, it doesn't matter where a crisis starts. It always ends in Argentina. Contagion for Argentina is always there. Because what happens is that Argentina has a fundamental problem. And it's not its exchange rate. Has tried with all of them. It has a fiscal problem, an incapacity to manage on a consistent basis a good fiscal management because of many reasons, again, not to be explained here. But the IMF is actually facing right now a huge problem, including with its own credibility. Remember that the last time that its program failed was precisely with Argentina. So, that was the early 2000s, right? So Argentina is having actually the IMF capture right now. And that's why the IMF remains silent. It is a default that has taken place right now, right? It's calling voluntary or not calling voluntary doesn't matter. The fact is that capital control have been imposed. And this is very important. People say, well, everything would have gone well with Macri, with the government in Argentina, if he would have been reelected. Really? I think the fundamentals were really wrong if the day you have a political shock, immediately a week after you say, okay, I don't have reserves to pay back. Okay? So the fundamentals in Argentina were really weak. I have to stop here only because stop. I can keep talking.
No, we are 20 minutes late, so please, if you can make it 1 minute and 1 minute, better.
Just very quickly on capital flow management measures, I think we need to distinguish between measures to deal with inflows and measures to deal with outflows. To deal with inflows might be much easier than to deal with outflows.
Just very quickly on capital flows, I agree with Jacob. I think they change the distribution. It's Knightian uncertainty rather than the type of uncertainty. So it really even changed the distribution for investors of what to expect, because the most unexpected thing can happen. And I agree with you completely. And in terms of the bad ideas, I think there has been a growing gap or a widening gap between expectations and opportunities in many of our countries. And that has been what has led to try to have short-term solutions. And I think we need to understand the problem to try to mitigate some of the mirage alternatives.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank you with another applause.
Thank you, Julio.